The wolf was still moving when Ezekiel Reed drove his boot into its ribs and wrenched the steel trap free from its jaws, and by that point the storm had already swallowed the tree-line whole. He had not planned to be this far north of the Greywall outpost at dusk. He had not planned a lot of things in his life lately. He had not planned to leave the fighting pits of Dunmere, had not planned to spend 3 years as the South's most feared duelist before walking away with his knuckles cracked and his heart hollowed out. And he had certainly not planned to settle in a crumbling 2-room bunk at the edge of the frozen territories, where the winters ran 8 months long, and the nearest tavern was a half-day's trek on a good horse. But plans had a way of dissolving around Ezekiel Reed, and so he stood in ankle-deep snow at the tree line with a dead wolf at his feet and a storm wall swallowing the last gray light of the afternoon sky, thinking that this was probably going to be an inconvenient evening. He was 29 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who had earned their muscle fighting for crowds who bet coin on whether he'd still be standing, with dark hair cropped close against the cold, and a jaw that looked like it had lost arguments with fists more than once, which it had. He wore heavy oilskin over layered wool, iron-toed boots that reached his knees, and a short sword he'd had no occasion to draw since arriving in Greywall. He'd come north to stop being a man people pointed at. He was crouching to inspect the trap's mechanism, one of a series he'd set for the gray wolves that had been raiding the settlement's goat pens, when he heard it. Not an animal sound. Too deliberate. Boots punching through crusted snow, fast and heavy, coming from the northeast ridge. He stood and turned, and that was when Snaga Doomhammer walked out of the storm like she owned the weather. She was enormous, or rather she was tall, nearly a full head above him, built with the kind of physical authority that made the word strong sound insufficient. Not hulking or monstrous, as the old soldiers' stories described her kind, but powerful in the way of something that had never once questioned whether it was allowed to take up space. She wore close-fitted warrior's leathers dyed deep charcoal gray, the chest piece laced tight over a quilted underlayer, the bracers buckled to the elbow, knee-high riding boots with iron heel plates and a curved short axe at each hip. A hood of dark wolf fur framed her face, and her face, he made himself acknowledge it quickly. The way you acknowledge a fire you weren't expecting was extraordinary. Green-skinned, darker than summer moss and lighter than pine shadow, high cheekbones that cut hard lines under dark eyes, a pair of lower tusks that curved just above her jaw line, and which she wore with the absolute indifference of someone who has never once thought about whether another person found them alarming. Her black hair was pulled back in a thick braid that fell over one shoulder, and she was carrying in her arms, rather than wearing on her person, a second set of leather bracers and a broken recurve bow, and there was blood on her left forearm, though not much of it. She stopped when she saw him. Her dark eyes moved down his body and back up in one flat, professional sweep, the way a person sizes up a potential obstacle. "You're Ezekiel Reed," she said. It was not a question. "Last time I checked," he said. She looked at the dead wolf, then at the trap in his hands, then back at his face, and whatever she was calculating, she calculated it fast. "There is a pack," she said. 12 or more, larger than normal. They have been following me from the Blackhorn Pass for 2 days. I cut 3 of them down, but the rest have split, half circling left, half right. They will come through this clearing in approximately 8 minutes. He looked at the storm. He looked at the tree line. He looked at the broken bow in her arms. "You want to borrow something?" "I want," she said, with the precision of someone choosing words carefully, "to not spend all night in a tree. My objective is the Greywall settlement. Yours, presumably, is also the settlement. We can reach it faster together. The wolves will not press if there are 2 of us moving hard." She paused. "Also, I need someone to hold a torch." "That's practical," he said. "I am practical," she said. It did not sound like a compliment to herself. It sounded like a classification. He gathered his traps, checked his blade, and jerked his head toward the southeast path. They moved. The 8 minutes she had estimated turned out to be 6, and the wolves did not give them an easy walk of it. 3 peeled off the pack and tracked them for almost a mile before Snaga, without ceremony, flung one of her short axes end over end through the dark and put it cleanly between the lead animal's shoulders. The other 2 fell back after that. Ezekiel had kept the torch up and his sword loose in his hand, and his mouth shut for the duration, which she would later claim was the most sensible thing any man had done in her company in years. They reached the outer fence of Greywall Outpost with the storm fully howling, the gate already drawn, and the watchman on the tower squinting down through snow with a pike he would not have been able to do much useful with. Ezekiel identified himself. The gate opened. Snaga walked through without asking permission, which the watchman clearly did not love, but he was cold enough and the night was bad enough that he only tightened his jaw and said nothing. The settlement of Greywall was not much to love from the outside. 30-odd buildings pressed close together inside a log palisade, the structures all low and thick-walled against the weather, smoke rising from every chimney into a sky that no longer had a color. The main thoroughfare was wide enough for 2 wagons abreast and ran from the gate straight to Herrick's alehouse, which was both the settlement's social heart and its only source of warmth that did not require owning a hearth. Ezekiel had a bunk at the back of the stable master's building, an arrangement that was cheap and private and suited him perfectly well. He was about to peel off toward it when Snaga stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the thoroughfare with snow building on her shoulders and said, in the same flat tone she'd used for everything so far, "You know who I am." "Snaga Doomhammer," he said. "I've been in Greywall 5 months. People talk." "What do they say?" He considered lying, then decided she'd probably know it. "They say you're the best tracker in the Blackhorn territories and that you're the one who's been following the wolf pack. They say you're the one who warned the settlement council 3 weeks ago that something had driven the pack south. They say the council thanked you and gave you nothing, and told you your services were not required." Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted very slightly toward acknowledgement. "They also likely say I am an orc and therefore not to be trusted." "Some of them," he said, "not all." She studied him again with those dark eyes that seemed to do their measuring at a different depth than most people's. Then she said, "You were in the Dunmere pits. The duelist. I saw you fight once when I was passing through the south. You were fast and you did not enjoy it." He felt something tighten in his chest, the old familiar press of a thing he'd left behind. "You have a good memory," he said. "I remember useful things," she said. Then with abrupt finality, as if the topic was closed, "The wolves are going to hit the east pen. Tonight if the storm drops, tomorrow morning if it does not. The fence there is rotten on the lower third, and there is a gap near the gate post that 3 wolves abreast could push through." "I know," he said. "I told the council that 2 weeks ago." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite disdain but lived somewhere between the two. "Then you know it is not fixed." "I know it is not fixed," he said. "So," she said, "what do you intend to do about it?" He had not expected her to still be standing there in the morning. He did not say that. Instead he said, "Come look at the fence with me tomorrow at first light and tell me if your count is right. If it is, I'll reinforce it myself and will set a line of the traps I pulled tonight across the gap. If the pack pushes anyway, 2 people on the east side are better than 1. She considered this for a long, flat moment. Then she nodded, once, the way a general confirms a battle plan that is merely adequate, and walked without further comment toward the alehouse. He watched her push through the door, watched the brief visible flinch from the people nearest the entrance, watched her ignore it with the clean totality of someone who has had a great deal of practice, and then he went to his bunk. He lay there in the dark, listening to the storm, thinking about a woman who carried broken bows and threw axes in the dark and walked through hostility like it was weather. He did not sleep particularly well. They met at the east fence at first light, which in deep winter at Greywall meant a thin gray rind of brightness that passed for dawn and lasted about 3 hours before the dark came back. Snaga was already there when he arrived, crouching at the base of the gate post in the snow, pressing the heel of her hand against a board that gave with a soft, rotten creak. She did not look up. 4 feet of rotten fencing, she said. Not 3 wolves abreast. 4. Great, he said, and set down the tools he'd borrowed from the settlement carpenter. They worked for 2 hours in near silence. He found quickly that silence with her was not uncomfortable. She did not fill space with words unless words were the right tool, and she worked with her hands the way she moved through everything else, efficiently, without waste, and with an economy of effort that suggested she had thought the task through before beginning. She held timbers while he hammered. She pointed out a secondary weakness in the fencing he had missed. When he dropped a nail through his half-frozen fingers, she picked it up from the snow without comment and placed it back in his palm, and the moment her fingers brushed his he felt it everywhere. He was sure she did not notice. She was already back to pressing boards. By the time they were done, the cold had gotten properly vicious, and he had filled the gap and reinforced the post and laid the trap line behind the fence where the snow was churned with old wolf tracks. Snaga stood back and inspected the work with her arms folded across her chest, which he was beginning to understand was her version of a nod of approval. "This will hold," she said. "Probably," he said. "Probably," she repeated, and there it was, the first hint of something like warmth in her voice, something dry and precise that was entirely her own. It was not a smile. It was the shape a smile might take if it had learned to be careful. "Have you eaten?" he asked. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it is cold and we've been working and Herrick's alehouse opens at sunrise," he said. "Not for any other reason." She was quiet for a moment. "I will not be welcomed there." "I'll be with you," he said. Another pause, shorter this time. "You think that changes things?" "I think it might change enough things," he said. It changed about half of them. The alehouse was warm and low-ceilinged, and smelled of burned fat and pine resin, and when they walked in together there was a particular variety of silence. The kind that is not total quiet but is the careful recalibration of who is allowed to say what in front of whom. Herrick himself was a squat, pragmatic man who had once bought a full winter's worth of smoked elk from an orc trapper without moral crisis, and he set down 2 mugs of hot spiced broth without being asked, and said nothing useful to anyone. 2 men in the corner found something interesting to look at on the table. A woman near the fire moved her chair a few inches, which could have been interpreted as making room or could have been interpreted as the opposite, and nobody pressed the point. Snaga sat across from Ezekiel and wrapped her big hands around the mug and said, with her eyes on the table, "You did not have to do this." "No," he agreed. "You are either very brave or very naive," she said. "Probably neither," he said. "I just decided a long time ago to stop making room for people's worst tendencies by letting them win without a fight. It costs less energy than I used to think." She looked at him for a longer moment, and then she drank her broth, and Ezekiel felt something in the room settle, the way a fire settles when you add the right piece of wood. She did not leave the settlement. He had half expected her to. She had the air of someone who moved, who did not stay in places longer than they required. But she hired a corner of the stable from the master, which cost almost nothing because almost nobody wanted it, and she was there the next morning and the morning after that. She spent her days ranging the tree line in a wide circuit, tracking the wolf pack's movements, and she reported what she found each evening with the flat directness of a scout delivering intelligence, first to the council, who thanked her politely while clearly believing her information was only coincidentally useful, and then, when she was done being thanked with no result, to Ezekiel, who listened to everything she said. He liked listening to her. She had a brain like a piece of fine mechanism, precise, interconnected, nothing wasted, and she had spent a decade and more in these territories, following pack lines and reading weather and understanding the rhythms of things. She knew the wolf pack's alpha was a male with a notched left ear, larger than normal for the species, lean rather than massive, which meant he was smart rather than dominant by size. She knew the pack was being pushed south by something on the Blackhorn Ridge. She suspected a cave bear, denning late due to the unusually long autumn, and she had gone up far enough to find prints that confirmed it. "The wolves aren't the real problem," she told him on the fourth evening, sitting across from him in the alehouse while the storm ran again outside. "The pack wouldn't have come this far south in normal seasons. They're displaced, frightened. A frightened pack is more dangerous than an aggressive one because fear makes the decisions irregular. And the council thinks you're making trouble," he said. "The council," she said, "is composed of men who have never been frightened enough to become irregular." She said it without particular heat. It was a statement of fact from someone who had clearly made peace with it long ago. "The bear needs to be dealt with," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's a different kind of problem than wolves." "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat with that for a moment, and Ezekiel turned his mug in his hands and thought about the kind of work he had left behind and the kind of work that was apparently still finding him, and then he said, "You're not going to do it alone." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite sharply enough controlled to hide what it was covering, which was something that might have been surprise or relief or the beginning of something she had not planned for. "I am capable," she said. "I know you are," he said. "That isn't what I said." A breath of silence. "You were a pit fighter," she said, "not a hunter." "I was a very good pit fighter," he said, "who is no longer fighting in pits and who has been spending 5 months getting reacquainted with the outdoors. I know how to use a blade, I know how to move quiet in the cold, and I have been told I am occasionally useful to have alongside. By you, actually. Yesterday," the not-quite smile again, sharper this time, "I said you knew how to hold a torch." "High praise," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, the approach from the north face is the only one that puts the wind in our favor. It requires crossing the ridge above the tree line." "When?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring, and then she said, "Tomorrow, before the next storm front arrives, first light." "I will be at the gate," he said. She nodded. She started to rise, and then she stopped and sat back down and said with a kind of precision that cost her something, "Ezekiel, you understand what this settlement would say, what they would believe if they saw you choosing to work alongside me. That I have better judgment than they do," he said. "Yes." She looked at him, really looked with all that depth and acuity, and then she said very quietly, "You are strange." "You're the third person to say that," he said. "I'm starting to take it as a compliment." She rose then and walked to the door and paused with her hand on the frame, and without turning said, "It was a compliment." Then she was gone, and the door swung shut behind her, and Ezekiel Reed sat in the warm and noisy alehouse feeling something he had not felt in a very long time, a kind of specific aliveness that starts in the chest and spreads outward, that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with being looked at by somebody who actually sees you. The next morning they were both at the gate before first light, their breath clouding the dark, and they walked north together into the mountains cold. The approach to the Blackhorn Ridge was brutal. The snow was thigh-deep in the open passages between the pines, and the wind came off the northern face in sheets that found every gap in every layer, and the light when it came was thin and flat, and cast everything in a colorless gray. Snaga moved through all of it the way she moved through everything, without complaint, without visible effort, reading the terrain with a practiced eye and adjusting the route in small ways he would not have known to make. She pointed out a shelf of wind-loaded snow above a narrow passage without breaking stride. She changed direction once, abruptly, and showed him afterwards the depression in the crust where something very heavy had crossed in the night. Bear's track, fresh enough that the edges had not yet iced over. "She has been ranging," Snaga said, crouching over the track, pressing 2 fingers into the impression. "Looking for something. The pack has been harassing her from the south, that's what keeps pushing them toward Greywall. She attacks, they scatter south, she pulls back, they return, the cycle repeats. So if we push the bear north," he said, "the pack loses its reason to range south." "That is the theory," she said. "Cave bears do not want confrontation. She has a den. If we give her a reason to feel her den is more secure than this wandering, she will return to it. And we do that how?" She stood. We make ourselves very loud and very large on the southern approach to her territory so she understands the threat is from the south. Then she goes north. Then the wolves follow their food north. Then the settlement's pens are safe. That requires getting close enough to her that she knows we're a threat, he said. Yes, she said, without getting close enough that she solves the problem of us. That, she said, is why two people are better than one. One draws attention. One moves position. She cannot charge two directions at once. It was, he thought, a plan that was simple in the same way a knife is simple, in that its effectiveness depended entirely on the quality of the hands holding it. They moved up the ridge. They found her on a ledge above a dry stream bed, a bear the size of a small cart, gray-brown and massive in her winter coat, and she lifted her great head from whatever she had been investigating and fixed them with small, terrible eyes that held a flat and impersonal fury. Snaga put 2 fingers on Ezekiel's arm. He understood. Hold. She moved left along the ledge, slow and deliberate, making herself visible, talking in a low, steady rhythm in her own language, not words for him. Words for the bear, words that said, "Here, I am here. This is my territory too, move on." The bear's head tracked her. Ezekiel moved right. The bear heard him shift his weight and spun with a speed that no animal that size had any right to possess. And for a moment, he looked directly into the center of a charging cave bear's chest and did not run, which was either bravery or a very thorough application of the instruction Snaga had given him. That running triggered pursuit, that stillness confused, that the bear had to understand they were not prey. Then Snaga's voice rose sharp, commanding, enormous for a woman her size, and she drove both axes flat-bladed against a pine trunk in a crack of sound that echoed off the ridge like a rifle shot. The bear stopped, looked at her, looked at him, made a sound low in its chest that was not a roar but was something older and worse, and then it turned, and it moved north up the ridge, and it did not look back. Ezekiel breathed. "Now," Snaga said, already moving south, "we move before she changes her mind." They were down from the ridge before noon, and they were 3 miles from Greywall when the storm came early. He felt it change before he saw it, a drop in the wind that was not calm but pressure, the specific silence of a sky that is gathering itself. Snaga stopped and looked up at the clouds with an expression that could have been calculation or concern, and then looked at him and said, "This is going to be significant." "How far are we?" he said. 3 miles, perhaps 4. The direct route crosses the open flat." She paused. "The sheltered route is through the east gully. It is longer, adds a mile, but it keeps us out of the worst of the wind." "The east gully," he said. She nodded and altered course, and the storm came down. It came the way bad northern storms come, not building, but arriving, as if it had been present all along and had simply decided to become visible. The snow was immediate and thick and horizontal, and the cold that came with it was a different animal than the cold of the morning, with teeth and purpose. He kept his head down and followed her trail because she was breaking it, her big body shouldering through the drifts with mechanical consistency, and he understood viscerally why she had said 2 people, because alone in this he would have been in serious trouble within the first half-mile. They were an hour into it, moving well, when his left leg went through the crust. Not a dramatic thing. Just a hidden shelf of ice over a lower depression, and his left boot punched through it. And when he wrenched himself free, his knee bent wrong, and something in the outer face of his knee announced itself in a very unfriendly way. And he went down on one hand in the snow and stayed there for a moment, not because of the pain, though the pain was real, but because he was doing a quick, honest inventory of how bad it was. Snaga was 5 strides ahead when she heard him hit the snow. She turned and covered the ground back to him in 3 steps and crouched beside him, and her eyes did the same flat inventory his had done, and then she said, "Stand up." He stood. He took 1 step. The leg held, but the knee was already swelling in the boot, and the movement was compromised, not broken, not ligament destroyed, but badly wrenched and getting stiffer by the minute in the cold. He looked at her. She looked at him. They both understood the math without saying it. 2 miles still to go, 1 functioning pair of legs between them. "I can manage," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was briefly, specifically, extremely frank. "You cannot manage 2 miles through this at half speed," she said. "We would still be on the flat when the worst comes through. What's the alternative?" He said, and then he understood, and she clearly saw him understand it, and her expression went from frank to something that was briskly neutral. "Put your arm over my shoulders," she said. "Snaga, Ezekiel Reed," she said, with a patience that was very close to its end. "I am twice your weight in functional muscle, and I know this terrain better than anyone in that settlement. You will put your arm over my shoulders, I will take your weight, and we will move at a pace that does not kill us. This is not a discussion, this is logistics." He put his arm over her shoulders, she moved. And he experienced the peculiar and thoroughly humbling sensation of being moved by someone else's will, held upright by strength that was not his own, through snow that was by that point genuinely mid-thigh deep in the low spots. She did not slow. She did not complain. She adjusted her grip when the drifts changed, and she redirected twice, and she talked not to him, but steadily, a low, constant voice, the same thing she'd done with the bear, and he understood after a moment that she was doing it for him, giving him something to track through the white noise of the storm, something that was not the cold and the pain and the sound of the wind. 3 feet of snow in the worst of the gully. He measured it against the top of his knee on the far side of the drift. She drove through it without breaking stride. He did not know how long it took. He focused on the sound of her voice and on keeping his good leg useful and on not being dead weight when he could help it. The settlement lights appeared in the gray before he expected them, orange and dim through the white. And then they were at the gate, and the watchman was hauling it open, and Snaga walked him through and did not stop until they were in the shelter of the stable master's building. She set him down against the wall and stepped back and said, in a voice that was flat and careful and entirely controlled, "Your knee requires heat and binding. Sit here." "You dragged me 2 miles through that," he said. "I walked you," she said. "There is a difference." "In what sense?" "In the sense that dragging implies I had difficulty," she said. "I did not have difficulty. I had an inconvenience." She was already moving toward the supply corner of the stable where he kept his kit, and she did not look at him while she said it, and the absolute determined flatness of her voice was the most transparent thing he had ever heard. "Snaga," he said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. Not profusely, just cleanly, the way she would have said it if the positions had been reversed. She was quiet for a long moment. Her back was to him. He could see the set of her shoulders, the slight unsteadiness in them that was not exhaustion. She was not tired, but something else, something that did not have a logistical name. "It was inconvenient," she said, "not heroic." "Right," he said. She came back with bandages and turned to face him and knelt and began working on his knee, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the storm ran outside, and the stable was warm and close with the smell of horses and pine. And Ezekiel watched her hands work and felt the warmth of her through his clothing, and thought about the fact that someone had carried him through 3 feet of snow and called it logistics, and then been unable to quite make her voice stay steady when he thanked her for it. He reached out and set his hand over hers where it rested on his knee, over the bandage, just his hand on hers, steady and still. She went very still. Then she looked up. And the thing that had been building since the tree line, since the broth and the alehouse, since the bear on the ridge and her voice cracking out in command across the valley, all of it was in her face, just for a moment, unguarded and plainly visible. She was frightened. Not of him, of this, of whatever it was that was building between them. "I don't know how to," she started, and then stopped. "You don't have to know," he said. "Neither do I." She looked at his hand on hers for a long time. Then she turned her hand under his and held it, and she did not let go until long after the knee was bound. And by then, the storm outside had slowed to a murmur. The wolf pack hit the east fence 2 nights later. It was 3 in the morning and the settlement was asleep, and the first alarm was the sound of the traps going off in sequence, snap, crack, crack, and Ezekiel was up and armed before the second cry of the watch bell reached him. His knee was bandaged and functional, sore but holding, and he made it to the east fence at a dead jog. Snaga was already there. She had both axes in her hands, and she was standing at the fence line in the dark with 3 wolves down in the snow behind the gate post and the rest of the pack in the tree's shadow, visible as pairs of eyeshine in the dark, uncertain, held back by the loss of their forward scouts. She was talking to them, the same low rhythm, and the pack was still. Ezekiel came to her left and drew his short sword and said nothing, and she said nothing, and they stood together at the fence in the dark and watched the pack reconsider. It took perhaps 8 minutes. Then the eyeshine began to fade, one pair at a time, moving north. The pack leaderless, uncertain, pushed by the absence of the bears' pressure on their southern range, was withdrawing. He and Snaga stood there until the last of the eyeshine was gone. Then she turned and looked at him and said, "That is the last time. They will not come back in force this winter." "Is that a guarantee?" he said. "No," she said. "It is a very confident assessment." He laughed. He had not laughed out loud in so long that it surprised him almost as much as it surprised her, and she looked at him with wide eyes, and then something happened in her expression that he would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and never quite manage, except to say that it was the moment her face fully arrived at a decision it had been approaching since the tree line. She stepped forward and kissed him, not gently, not experimentally. With the same directness she brought to everything, both hands coming up to frame his face, and he kissed her back with everything he had, because there was no other appropriate response to being kissed by a woman who had just held a wolf pack at bay, and who smelled of pine smoke and cold air and iron, and who was, in that moment, the most vivid thing he had encountered in years. When she pulled back, they were both breathing harder than the cold accounted for, and she kept her hands on his face for a moment longer, looking at him in the dark as if she was still calibrating, still checking that the calculation had come out right. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "That was not logistical," he said, something that was finally, fully, unambiguously a smile. "No," she said, "it was not." They were not subtle about it after that, but neither were they performing. They simply stopped maintaining the arrangement of 2 people who happened to work alongside each other, and became something more legible to themselves, and to the settlement, which drew the reactions one would expect in a place like Greywall, which was to say a spectrum ranging from genuine warmth on one end to cold hostility on the other, with a large, uncomfortable middle ground occupied by people who did not know what to do with it. Herrick refilled their mugs without being asked, and one morning left a second bowl of salt elk at the table without comment, which was his form of endorsement. The settlement carpenter, whose materials Ezekiel had borrowed for the fence repair, came by one afternoon to collect a debt, and ended up sharing 2 hours of conversation about timber quality and stayed for supper, and afterward he shook Snaga's hand like she was anyone. The council was more ambiguous. Councillor Prast, who ran the provision exchange and who had a way of speaking about orcs as a category rather than as people, began making pointed observations at public gatherings about the settlement's traditions regarding those who were not residents in good standing. Snaga heard about this. Her response was to go to Prast's provision exchange the next morning and pay for a month's worth of feed grain in full coin, on the counter, in front of 6 witnesses, which was a more elegant response than Ezekiel had thought of, and which effectively closed the argument for anyone whose objections were actually financial. She was magnificent, and he told her so, and she said, "I know," without a trace of false modesty. He was not passive in his admiration. He also was not a man who required saving at every turn. He had made his own way for a long time and was reasonably good at it. But he had the sense, increasingly, of what it felt like to have someone at his back who was absolutely loyal and absolutely capable, and the particular quality of that feeling for a man who had spent years entirely alone in his own corner of the world was something that could not be adequately described in plain language. He showed her the fighting stances he'd been taught in Dunmere that were designed for weapon-to-weapon, not the brutal pit style. She was already a better fighter than him in raw terms, but she found the footwork genuinely useful, and she adapted it to her own style in about 3 sessions, and added a pivot that he couldn't follow but could appreciate. He taught her a card game he'd learned from a river merchant, and she beat him at it ruthlessly by the 3rd evening, which seemed about right. She told him about the territories she had worked, the long winters and the wide summers, and the high passes that were beautiful enough to make a person who was not given to sentiment stop and breathe. And he listened to all of it with the attention of someone who intended to go there. The second time they kissed was in his bunk with the door latched, and the storm outside, and neither of them with anywhere else to be. And it was longer than the first, and warmer, and he felt her hands in his hair and felt her exhale against him with the specific quality of someone who has put something down they have been carrying for a very long time. She was not shy about wanting him. She had none of the tentativeness he might have expected from a person so guarded in every other register. When she decided on something, she moved toward it with her whole self, and the fact that he was the thing she had decided on was not something he was able to entirely comprehend, but intended to spend a very great deal of time being grateful for. It was 2 weeks after the wolves cleared out that the trouble arrived. His name was Cordon Vase, and he rode into Greywall on a gray horse with 6 men at his back, and a leather coat with a bronze clasp at the collar that indicated he held a provisional charter from the Lowland Territories, which was a piece of paper that had about as much meaning at this range from the charter office as a fish bone in a storm. He was 35 and lean, and had the specific quality of handsomeness that comes from awareness of one's own handsomeness, and he set up at the alehouse that first evening and bought a round for the room, and was charming in the way that a trap baited with meat is charming. Ezekiel watched him from his corner table and understood him in about 4 minutes. Snaga was out on the ridge circuit and had not come back yet, and he noted, as the evening progressed, that Vase had been asking questions about the settlement, about the territory, about the wolf-pack situation, about who was responsible for what, and increasingly about the orc woman who was apparently being allowed to range and report. He found out from Herrick, over a quiet second mug, that Vase held a trapping charter for a corridor of the Eastern Territories that included the Blackhorn Pass area, and that his interest in the wolf situation was not humanitarian but commercial. The wolf pelts were worth real money, and the pack had been too disrupted to trap effectively while they were ranging south, and Vase was here to assess whether the pack had been cleared and whether the trapping corridor was now open. He was also here, it became clear over the next 2 days, to establish that whatever arrangement existed between the settlement and the orc tracker was informal and therefore void, and that anyone holding a charter had legal precedence in the matter of who hunted and tracked in the corridor. This was, as a legal argument, paper-thin at this range from any court. But it was the kind of paper-thin argument that worked in a small settlement full of people who were already uncertain about Snaga's presence, and Vase was good at deploying it. He was also, which was the part that produced in Ezekiel a very specific temperature behind the sternum, openly and deliberately attentive to Snaga. He was in the alehouse the evening she came back from the ridge, and he rose when she entered and introduced himself with the particular quality of charm that is designed to look respectful while being its opposite. And he told her he had heard a great deal about her skills and would be very interested in discussing the territory over supper. His eyes did not stay on her face the whole time he said it, and the men at his back grinned in a way that had nothing to do with professional admiration. Snaga looked at him the way she looked at a fence post. "I am not available for supper," she said, and moved past him. He followed at a half-step which was already past the point of welcome, and said that he understood she had been providing information to the Settlement Council regarding the Eastern Corridor, and that as a charter holder he had a few questions that required answers. "Tomorrow," she said, still moving, "at the council building with witnesses." "I was thinking somewhere more comfortable," he said. Ezekiel stood up. It was not a violent movement. He did not make it a performance. He simply stood from his corner at his full height, with the stillness of a man who has been in a very large number of rooms where someone is about to do something stupid, and has learned that stillness is more effective than motion as a preventive measure. Vase looked at him. The 6 men at his back looked at him. Snaga had stopped walking and turned around, and she watched him with dark eyes that were impossible to read from across the room. Ezekiel Reed, Vase said, and his tone recalibrated, not afraid but acknowledging. I know that name from Dunmere. Most people do, Ezekiel said. She said tomorrow, at the council building, with witnesses. That seems clear. Vase held his gaze for a long moment, and then he smiled with about 3/4 of his earlier warmth and said, Fair enough, tomorrow at the council building. He turned back to his table. Snaga crossed the room to Ezekiel's corner and sat across from him and said quietly with her elbows on the table, I did not need that. I know, he said. I needed it. I don't enjoy watching that. She looked at him for a moment. You were jealous, she said. Yes, he said without hesitation, which was apparently not the answer she'd expected, because her expression shifted in a way that was briefly and entirely unguarded. He does not interest me, she said. I know that too, he said. Doesn't change what it felt like to watch. She was quiet for a moment, and then slowly she reached across the table and set her hand over his, the same way he had set his hand over hers in the stable, and she said, There is no one else, Ezekiel. There has not been for some time. I did not understand why until you. He looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face. He said, I spent 3 years in the pits fighting men for coins and crowds, and I never once in that time felt like I was worth seeing. I have felt that every day since you walked out of the storm. Something moved through her expression that was deep and warm and real, and she tightened her hand over his. Vase left them alone that night, but the morning after at the council building he made his move. The meeting was public. Half the settlement crowded into the council room or stood at the door, and Vase laid out his charter with the precision of a man who had been setting this stage since he arrived. The territorial claim, the legal precedence of charter holders over informal agreements, the argument that the pack management had been concluded, and the corridor was now accessible to licensed hunters, and the very carefully shaped suggestion that the settlement's ongoing arrangement with a non-resident orc tracker created a liability that the council should consider in light of the charter regulations. It was dressed well. It sounded almost reasonable if you were not paying close attention. Snaga sat at the table across from him with her arms folded and her face arranged in that specific neutral expression that Ezekiel now knew indicated she was choosing her words with considerable care. He stood at the side of the room. She let Vase finish. Then she unrolled a document on the table, a survey she had made herself in detail over the past weeks of the eastern corridor, including all trap lines, pack movements, bear signs, and past conditions, with dates and specifics that would have taken a charter survey team a month to produce. This, she said, is a complete territory assessment of the Blackhorn corridor as of this week. There is no charter survey for this region because no charter surveyor has come this far north in 3 seasons. This document establishes a prior knowledge claim under the Territorial Commons Code, which outranks provisional charter in the case of documented existing use. She looked at Vase. I know the Commons Code because the Commons Code is how I have protected my right to operate in territories like this my entire career. You should have read it before you rode north. Vase looked at the document. He looked at her. He looked at the council, who were looking at the document, and 2 of whom, including the council chair, appeared to be actually reading it. This is irregular, he said. The Commons Code does not require regularity, she said. It requires documentation and dates. The council chair set down the document and said, with the care of a man choosing his position on ground that had shifted unexpectedly, this appears to be a valid claim under the Commons provision. Councillor Prast, do you have the regulation book? Prast produced it. The regulation book confirmed what Snaga had said. Vase sat with a controlled expression and said nothing, but the 6 men at his back were looking at each other in a way that did not suggest the evening was going to be straightforward. The council chair ruled in favor of Snaga's prior knowledge claim. It was not everything. The charter was not nullified. Vase still had access to the corridor, but Snaga's standing was formally recognized, which meant the council was publicly acknowledging her right to operate, to report, and to be there. Prast voted against it, which surprised no one. Vase stood up when it was over and looked at Snaga with a smile that had completely stopped being charming. "This isn't how business works out here," he said. "It is now," she said. He left the building and his men left with him, and the crowd in the door shifted back, and in the middle of it all Ezekiel made his way to her side and said very quietly near her ear, "That was exceptional." She looked straight ahead, but her mouth curved. "I know," she said. 3 days later Vase made a different kind of move. He put out a challenge. It was framed as a competition, a settlement contest for the right to claim the corridor's first winter trapping permits, to be decided by a bout between his chosen representative and any challenger from the settlement or otherwise. His representative was a man named Bruck who had come with him in the party, a former soldier who was large in the way of someone who had been paid to stay large, and who had been seen since arrival moving in ways that suggested he was considerably more than merely big. The challenge was deliberately framed to neutralize the legal ground Snaga had won. If Vase's man won the bout, the corridor permits went to the charter party, Snaga's prior knowledge claim notwithstanding. It was the kind of raw frontier logic that only worked because everyone in the settlement knew the law was a long ride away. Ezekiel stood up in the middle of the alehouse when the challenge was read out and said, in a carrying voice, "I'll take the bout." The room went quiet. Vase, who was standing near the bar, looked at him with a particular expression, something that was calculating the difference between what it had expected and what it was getting. "You're retired," he said. "I'm not dead," said Ezekiel. Behind him, he heard Snaga say, just to him, just barely, with an edge he had not heard before, "Ezekiel." He turned. She was standing very still, and her expression was doing something complicated and not entirely calm. "I will fight him," she said quietly. "I know you can," he said. "Then why?" "Because he made it a legal settlement contest, and the settlement needs to see one of their own back you. They trust me. I have been here 5 months, and I have fixed their fence and trapped their wolves, and they trust me. If I fight for this, it carries a different weight for them than if you fight, and you know it." A beat of silence, her eyes on his face. "Also," he said less steadily, "I'm not capable of standing here while someone challenges something that is yours and doing nothing about it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped close and said very low, meant only for him, "Win." He won. It was not easy. Bruck was everything he looked like: heavy, experienced, genuinely dangerous. And he came at Ezekiel with the confidence of a man who had ended bouts before they properly began. The contest was blades and sheaths, grapple and strike, first man down and unable to rise. The settlement turned out for it. Everyone in the thoroughfare in the cold, stamping their feet and breathing clouds into the afternoon air, the crowd arrayed in a rough oval around the cleared space between the alehouse and the provision exchange. Snaga stood at the edge of the oval with her arms folded and her face still, and Ezekiel looked at her once before the bout started and then did not look at her again, because that was how you got hit. He took the first exchange badly. Bruck was faster than his size suggested and caught him across the cheekbone with an elbow in the first 10 seconds, which did something colorful to his vision and put him on the back foot for the next full minute. He stayed moving, stayed tight, used the footwork that was more Dunmere precision than Brawler's aggression, and let Bruck's weight work against him on the turns. By the second minute he had a read on the pattern. Bruck led with the right, followed with a low push, expected opponents to step back. He was programmed for opponents who feared him. Ezekiel stopped stepping back. He stepped into the third exchange instead of away from it, took the push on his left side, and used the momentum to drive his right elbow into Bruck's jaw and simultaneously sweep his left leg, which was the first real hold he'd landed and which, combined with Bruck's own forward drive, put the big man down on one knee in the snow. Bruck got back up. The crowd made noise. Proper noise, not polite noise. 4 minutes of work followed that were not clean and not elegant, and that cost Ezekiel a split lip, and what he strongly suspected was a cracked rib. But at the end of them, Bruck was face down in the snow with Ezekiel's knee in his back, and his arm bent the wrong direction for standing up, and the crowd was roaring, actually roaring, the way crowds roar when something has been decided, and Bruck said, from the snow, in the clipped voice of a man with remaining dignity, "Done." Ezekiel stood up. His vision was not entirely straight and his left side was making complaints he would deal with later, but he stood up clean and said, at a volume the whole oval could hear, "The corridor claims stand as the council ruled. Anyone who wants to dispute that can take it to a real charter court in the spring. Anyone who wants to push it before then answers to me." He looked at Vase when he said it. Vase held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he straightened his coat and said, to no one in particular, that the North wasn't worth the trouble of the ride, which was the thing people say when they are leaving with dignity instead of without it. He and his men were gone by morning. Snaga was waiting for him at the alehouse door. She walked to him through the dispersing crowd without hurry, and she looked at his face with the clinical attention of someone assessing damage, and then she said, "Your lip needs closing." "I know," he said. "And your rib," she said. "I know that too," he said. She reached up and set one hand against his jaw, the thumb just below the split lip, very gentle for hands that capable, and she said, in a voice that was not its usual flat control but something rower and more direct, "You did not need to do that." "You said when," he said. "I said when," she agreed. And then, "I did not say get hit in the face repeatedly." "Those were not separate options," he said, "so I prioritized the winning." She looked at him for a long moment with something that was entirely unguarded and warm and real, and then she pressed her forehead against his gently, because of the lip, and stayed there for a moment with her eyes closed and her hands holding his face. And around them the crowd had largely gone back to the alehouse, but a few people were watching, and it was visible and it was deliberate, and it was Snaga Doomhammer being publicly, unmistakably clear about what Ezekiel Reed was to her. He put his hands on her waist and held on. The rib was, in fact, cracked. Snaga wrapped it with the focused attention of someone who finds caregiving mildly undignified, but is doing it anyway, and who therefore wraps ribs with considerable efficiency. She was in his bunk beside him while she did it, and afterward they sat together with their backs against the wall and the lantern low and the storm doing its usual thing outside, and she said out of nowhere, "When the spring thaw comes, the pass will be open." "I know," he said. "I intend," she said carefully, "to go north. The Blackhorn passes, the high territories. There is work there and the winter packs should have cleared, and I have wanted to go back for a long time." He was quiet. "I am telling you," she said, "because you should know where I am going. I am not," a pause, a careful selection of words, "I am not asking you to stay here without me or to follow me or to do anything in particular. I am telling you because I have not in a very long time had someone who should know where I was going." He let that sit for a moment because it deserved to sit. "Are you asking me to come?" he said. She was quiet for longer than usual. "I am considering whether I have the right to ask." "Snaga," he said. "I have been sitting in a crumbling bunk at the edge of the world for 5 months trying to decide whether I had finished running away from things or was just building up speed. And then you walked out of a storm and called me useful because I could hold a torch, and I haven't once thought about running since. So yes, I will come. I would like to come very much, if you are asking." She was very still. "I am asking," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the same way they had done this from the beginning, and held it. Outside, the storm dropped to a murmur and then lower, and the night went soft and cold and still, and the lantern burned steady in the bunkroom, and they stayed like that for a long time while the settlement of Greywall slept around them, and somewhere on the northern ridge, the wolves ran quiet and the bear lay in her den, and the world, for a while, was manageable. But there was still the Blackhorn Pass. and winter was not finished. The pass itself was not passable until late in the season's turn. Snaga knew the exact window to the week, based on years of reading the ridge and the wind direction and the quality of the light. And so they had 6 weeks in Greywall while the cold held, and Ezekiel spent them healing the rib, which was not interesting, and learning from Snaga what he could of the Northern Territory's specific demands, which was extremely interesting. She taught him to read pack sign the way she did, not just prints but pressure, the way animal weight distributed differently in panic versus pursuit versus ordinary movement. She showed him 2 different methods for constructing a snow shelter that he had never encountered, one of which was exclusively an Orc Mountain clan technique that she had learned from her grandmother, and which produced a structure warmer and sturdier than anything he could build with conventional methods. He absorbed all of it with the attentiveness of someone who understands that knowledge is the best armor available. She learned things from him too. The card game she already beat him at. The specific way he organized his tools, which she initially dismissed and then quietly adopted because it was genuinely more efficient. The way he cooked salt elk with dried herbs that she had never tried and which turned out to be one of the better things either of them had eaten in months. Small things. The kinds of small things that build the connective tissue of a life shared. The settlement, as the weeks passed, made its peace. Not uniformly, Prast never warmed, and there were 2 households who did not look at Snaga directly and probably never would, but the majority moved from uncertain to accustomed to something that was, if not unreserved welcome, at least a kind of ordinary regard. She had protected their pens. She had beaten Vase in a legal contest. She had been here all winter and had not been what the fearful stories said, and she had chosen one of their own, which meant more than she knew. The night before they were set to leave, Herrick put out a proper supper for them. Not a party, nothing Snaga would have endured, but a good meal with good food and a table they shared with the carpenter and the stable master and the watchman from the gate. And Herrick himself, who sat down at the end for the first time Ezekiel had ever seen him sit at a table he wasn't serving. The watchman told a story about the first winter he'd spent at Greywall, and the supper stretched long into the night, and at one point Snaga laughed properly, fully, with her head tipped back at something the carpenter said, and Ezekiel felt something settle permanently into place, the way a key settles into a lock that was made for it. He told her that later in the quiet. She said without her usual deflection, "I have not laughed like that in very long time." "I know," he said. "I did not know I missed it," she said. "I had stopped noticing it was gone." He reached up and touched her jaw, the place where the tusk curved, which he had stopped noticing as a category separate from her face a long time ago and had simply become part of what her face was, and she tilted into the touch with a trust that went all the way to the bone. "You don't have to do any of that alone anymore," he said. "Noticing any of it." She put her hand over his. She said with the weight of someone saying the true version of a thing for the first time, "I know." He kissed her. She kissed him back. The lantern burned. They left at first light with the pass crisp and clear, and the mountain air thin and cold and gold with early sun, and the whole of Greywall was out to see them off in the loose, casual way of people who do not want to make a fuss but find themselves there anyway. The carpenter had repaired Snaga's bow. He had worked on it quietly for 2 weeks, having never attempted a recurve of that kind before, and it was a creditable job that she inspected seriously and nodded over and said was adequate, which made him so obviously proud that Ezekiel had to look at the mountain for a moment. They went north up the main road out of the settlement, and then off it onto the track that Snaga knew and which climbed steadily toward the first ridge. And after the first quarter mile, he looked back and the settlement was already small against the flat white of the valley, and the smoke from its chimneys went straight up in the still air, and it looked like what it was, which was a place where things had happened and been settled and could now be left. He did not feel like he was leaving. He felt like he was arriving, which was a distinction he had been trying to find the words for since October. Snaga walked beside him with her repaired bow across her back and her axes at her hips and her breath clouding in the cold, and she moved with the particular ease of someone who is going somewhere they have been trying to get to for a long time. The snow on the track was shin-deep, and the sky was the specific deep blue that only exists above the tree line in clear winter, and somewhere ahead the Blackhorn Ridge was gleaming white and enormous and real. "Tell me about the high territories," he said. She looked at the ridge ahead and said, "There are valleys that run east-west between the second and third passes that hold summer heat longer than they should. The grass grows green into autumn and there are elk herds that have never been seriously hunted. The southern face of the third pass overlooks a river valley that you can see for 50 miles on a clear day." "You've been there," he said. "Many times," she said. "I have never shown anyone." He absorbed this. "What changed?" She was quiet for a while. Just the sound of their boots in the snow and the wind in the pines and the huge blue silence of the mountain above. Then she said, "I stopped being certain that no one was worth showing." He looked at her profile against the sky. She was looking forward at the ridge with an expression that was open in a way he had only seen a handful of times, not neutral, not assessed, just present. "I would very much like to see it," he said. She turned to look at him and her expression did something that was entirely her own version of love, which was not soft or easy but was genuine and deep and had weight to it, the weight of something chosen rather than found, and she said, "Then we will go." They went. The first pass took them 2 days with one night camped in a shelter. She built with such speed and expertise that Ezekiel felt the satisfaction of a student who has finally understood what he was being taught. Her method, the Orc Mountain Clan technique, produced a space that was warm enough by midnight to shed the outermost layer, and he lay on his back looking at the curved snow ceiling and listening to the wind outside, and felt something so thoroughly at peace that it was almost startling. She lay beside him, her hand was in his. "Tell me about the pits," she said. He had not been asked this in a long time. He had not answered it when people tried to ask, because people asked with the prurient interest of people who want a story about violence and crowds, and he had not been interested in providing that. But this was Snaga, who asked things because she wanted to understand rather than to consume, and so he told her. He told her about the city of Dunmere, and the way the pits smelled iron and sawdust and sweat, and the particular cheap ale of the crowds, and the way a fight felt from inside it, which was different from how it looked, which was different from how it felt the next morning. He told her about the trainer who had first put a blade in his hand, and the fights that he won, and the ones that had been closer than they should have been. He told her about the evening he had stood over a man he had put down, and realized that the crowd's noise was not something he wanted to fill himself with anymore, that it had always been there on the outside and he had never actually taken it in. "I walked out the next morning," he said. "Just walked. No ceremony. Left the fighter's contract on the table and my gear in the locker and walked north until the city noise was gone." "What did you find up here?" she asked. "Cold," he said. "Quiet. And then eventually a wolf trap and a storm and you." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you sorry you stopped? Fighting in pits," he thought about it honestly. "No, I was very good at it and it gave me nothing I wanted to keep." "What do you want to keep?" she said. It was not a loaded question. It was a genuine one. He turned his head and looked at her in the near dark of the snow shelter, her face lit faintly by the cold light filtering through the ceiling, dark eyes on his. "This," he said. "Exactly this." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned toward him, shifting close, and the shelter was warm and the world outside was entirely separate from anything happening inside it, and she kissed him slowly and thoroughly, and with all the warmth she had been building toward since the tree line. When they pulled apart he could feel her smiling against his jaw. "Good," she said. "I would have been annoyed if the answer was different." He laughed, and she felt it against her cheek, and she pressed herself closer and pulled the furs up and said, "Sleep." "The second pass is harder." He slept. The second pass was harder. It earned that billing, a long scramble over exposed rock where the wind came at an angle that felt personal, and 2 sections where the footing was ice over stone and demanded full attention. He moved behind her and did what she said when she said it, and at the summit they stood together in the full weight of the northern wind and looked out over the view from the top of the world, which was exactly as vast and devastating as promised. He could see 50 miles south along the valley they had come from. He could see the faint, distant mark of Greywall, a dark cluster against white. He could see the ridge line of the Blackhorn spreading east and west, and the gray-white expanse of everything north of it that was beyond the third pass, which was still 2 days ahead, the high territories Snaga had described. "This is what I came north for," he said, not to her, just out loud. She stood beside him and did not say anything, which was its own response. On the north slope of the second pass, they found the cave bear's actual den, a wide depression in the rock face that was packed with dried grass and sheltered by an overhang, and the bear herself was visible within, a great gray-brown mass sleeping heavily, her breath clouding the den's air in slow rhythms. The tracks around the entrance were old, confirming she had come home and stayed. "She will sleep until thaw," Snaga said, studying the den with the same professional attention she gave everything. "The pack will go where the elk go. The corridor is clear." "Vase is going to come back in spring," Ezekiel said. "Yes," she said, "and the prior knowledge claim will still be valid, and this time the council will cite the ruling instead of deferring." She paused. "And if he tries something direct, the outcome will be the same as last time." "He's not Bruck," Ezekiel said. "No," she agreed. "He is cleverer than Bruck, which means he is more afraid of outcomes that cannot be managed." She looked at him. "He will not try something direct." Ezekiel considered this. "You have thought about this for a while." "I have thought about most things for a while," she said. "It is a habit." They made the third pass on the fourth day, and on the afternoon of the fourth day the high territories opened before them. She had not been wrong. The valley that ran east below the third pass was wider than he had imagined, the walls gentle and forested with pine that still held their dark green even in winter, and the valley floor showed the marks of the elk herd she had described. A whole landscape that had been living its own life, undisturbed, for as long as anything in it had been alive. They stood at the valley rim, and he did not speak for a while, and she stood beside him and did not need him to. Then she said quietly, "There is a section on the eastern end where the valley widens into a flat bench above the river, south-facing. The snow clears early. The land is good." He looked at her. She was looking at the valley, and her expression was doing something that was partly professional assessment and partly something else, something that wanted the words chosen precisely. "Good land," he said. "Good land," she said. "For someone who wanted to build something," a pause. "For two people who wanted to build something." He looked at the valley for a long moment. He thought about the bunk at Greywall and the pits at Dunmere and the gray rind of dawn light and 2 mugs of hot broth, and a fence being hammered together in the cold. He thought about her hands on his face in the dark outside the east pen and her forehead against his and the sound of her laugh at Herrick's table. "Is that what you want?" he asked. She turned to face him fully. She was never tentative, Snaga Doomhammer, not in any physical thing, not in a fight, not in a contest before a council, but in this moment she was careful in the way of someone who has been careful with this specific hope for a long time, who has carried it without looking at it directly, and who is now looking at it directly. "I want a place," she said, "that is mine and not borrowed. I want to range these territories and know the range and come back to somewhere. I want a breath to come back to someone. I want that to be you." He crossed the 2 steps between them and took her face in his hands, the way she had taken his, and he looked at her the way she had looked at him, with the full attention of someone who has finally found what they were looking at all along, and he said, "Then we will build it." She closed her eyes for a moment. He felt her breathe. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him, and there was nothing behind it now except what was there, no guard, no assessment, no careful selection of words, just her, entirely real and entirely present, looking at him with the specific expression of someone who has just put down something very heavy and found that their hands are free. He kissed her there on the rim of the valley with the whole high northern world spread below them and the cold air around them, and the sound of nothing but wind and pine. And she kissed him back with everything she was, and it tasted like a rival. They came back down through the passes over 3 days, unhurried now, with no deadline pressing them, and the quality of the journey changed. It was not a crossing anymore, but a route they were learning together, the specific way their route would go on the specific road between their life and the rest of the world. She pointed out landmarks. He noted what the passes needed in terms of a maintained track. They talked about the valley bench, the eastern flat, the construction of a proper structure that would survive the north winters with the stability of someone who had spent time in Greywall's buildings and understood what held and what didn't. She knew where to source stone. He knew how to lay it. She knew the territory's resources and the nearest settlement supply points and the seasonal conditions. He knew how to work with his hands and how to deal with people and how to stay standing when things pushed. It fit together cleanly. Not without effort, but cleanly, the way things fit when they were made for each other without either of them knowing it. On the last night before Greywall, they camped again in a snow shelter at the base of the first pass, and the night was clear and cold and brilliant with stars, and they lay together under the firs with the warmth they had built, and she said against his shoulder, "I used to believe that I was made for solitude." "What changed your mind?" he said. "Evidence," she said. He felt her settle further. He held her closer. "Snaga Doomhammer," he said into her hair. "Ezekiel Reed," she said. "You are the best thing that has ever walked out of a storm at me." A silence. Then, dry and warm and entirely hers, "I know." They arrived at Greywall in the early afternoon to find the settlement doing what it always did, working, arguing, surviving, generating a noise that was small but continuous against the vast white silence of everything around it. Herrick was outside the alehouse throwing grain and saw them come through the gate and waved without stopping what he was doing. The carpenter called from across the thoroughfare that the bow had held up had it. Snaga called back that it was acceptable workmanship, and the carpenter beamed. They told the settlement council that evening. Not in a formal meeting, Ezekiel went to the chair, who was a fair man whatever his limitations, and told him directly. They were planning to establish in the high territories. The prior knowledge claim would remain as documented. They would return through Greywall seasonally and could be called on for the corridor and pass assessments. The chair heard it out and then said, with the kind of simple plainness that Ezekiel had always respected in him, "Then we will hope the neighbors have good timing when they need to call." It was as clean an acknowledgement as they were going to get, and it was enough. They spent 4 more days in the settlement, gathering supplies, speaking with the carpenter about what they would need for a first structure, acquiring tools and seed stores against a spring that was still weeks away, but was now a fixed point in the calendar of their lives rather than an abstract future. On the last night, Snaga sat beside him at Herrick's table with her shoulder against his and her hand around a mug of warm ale, and she said nothing for a while, and he said nothing, and the alehouse was warm and full of the ordinary noise of people living their lives, and outside the long winter night pressed against the walls, and neither of them felt it as a weight. "Ready?" he asked. "I have been ready," she said, "since the tree line." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the fire in Herrick's hearth burned orange and steady, and the night outside was cold and enormous and full of everything they were going to walk into together. She was not a woman who explained herself in speeches. She was not a woman who made promises in formal language or dressed things in sentiment. But she had walked out of a storm and assessed him in flat professional terms and dragged him through 3 feet of snow on a cracked knee, and called it inconvenient instead of heroic, and kissed him at a fence line in the dark and stood with her forehead against his, while the crowd went home, and told him she had not, for some time, thought anyone was worth showing the high valley to, and then shown him the high valley. He understood all of that. He understood it the way he understood everything she said, directly, without translation, taking it at exactly the depth she meant. She had chosen him. Of all the things she could have been and all the directions she could have walked, she had walked out of that storm and kept walking toward him, and she had done it with her eyes open and her mind clear, the way she did everything, with full, deliberate intention. He did not think he would spend a day in the rest of his life failing to understand what that meant. The morning they left Greywall for the last time as temporary residents, the settlement was out again in its loose, casual way, and the sky was beginning its slow northern lean toward something that might eventually, in a month or two, be called spring. The light was changing, still cold, still thin, but the angle of it was different, the days a fraction longer than they had been a week ago. They went north on the main track and then off onto the ridge route, and Ezekiel Reed and Snaga Doomhammer walked out of Greywall the way they had arrived from the tree line side by side, without ceremony, into the cold and the light, and the settlement watch called something from the gate tower that was lost in the wind, and Snaga raised one hand in acknowledgement without looking back. He looked back once. The gate was still open, the watchman visible in the tower, the smoke from the chimneys still rising straight. A place that had been a waypoint and had become a kind of chapter. Then he faced forward again, north, up the ridge, toward the second pass and the third pass and the valley below the third pass that faced south and held summer heat longer than it should, and where on the eastern bench above the river there was good land. The snow was deep and the air was cold and the light was everywhere, and they moved through it together, into everything that came next.